So the paper I'm going to give to you today it's sort of been developing it's been developing for a long time, but I'm reflecting on what's going on in the last few years, and I'm involved in a research group called Living Legacies, which is funded by a research council in the UK and the Heritage Lottery Fund to investigate engagement with the First World War across Northern Ireland and beyond. So that's really has me doing this on a weekly basis. But in a more long-term way, I've been looking at how we remember contested histories in our museums and looking very much at community groups and community museums, which I might just ad-lib at the end of this paper of a few examples and conversations I've had since I've written the paper. So just to start, I'd like to say that in 2016, we're not just remembering the events of 1916. Instead, what we do today is a memory of the century since. So what I mean by that is we're not just looking what happened in 1916, we are looking at it informed by everything that's been happening since and what we want it to happen in the future. So every moment in the tricky century that has just passed comes together piece by piece to shape the character of our communities, at places and people. So in 2016, our commemorative practices in museums aren't only about the stories we can tell about that period and the objects we have. The interpretation in museums is shaped by a century of selective remembering, deliberate concealing, or even denial. This combines to tell the story we think is pertinent for the time we live in and influence it the way we desire. Put simply, how we choose to look upon a century ago and mark it in events, exhibitions and lecture programmes is an attempt to influence the here and the now. When I was asked to speak at this symposium, my invitation made reference to a book I published in 2000 on politics, archaeology and the National Museum, or a National Museum, and as themes for this. And the final chapter of my book was on links and legacy. So I went back and read the chapter, and it's a bit scary reading something you've written that long ago, but I got over that. My opening paragraph in that final chapter, I quoted John Collis, now Professor of Archaeology at the University of Sheffield, and he had this to say: "Unless we accept the political nature of our subject and face it head on, others will usurp it and use it in ways we might find unacceptable." So in that chapter, I looked at sort of the political consequences of this interest in the past. And in a way, sometimes that political interest might lead to outcomes that we welcome, and in other times, ones we do not. So on the one hand, political support may fuel research, may raise the profile of the study of historical objects. It creates demand for exhibitions, lecture tours and symposiums. The political interest in the past may underpin the case to justify the preservations of sites, monuments and archives, may encourage the creation of national collections as a state duty. But on the other hand, the political motivation to use the past can lead to a selection of the past that is politically biased, and preservation, display and interpretation that may be distorted and may lead to what has been referred to in literature as an abuse of history. We might argue if politics had no interest in the past, we would still have heritage found in museums, collections, monuments and research. This would be the utopian museum, existing without the interference of state and politics. I'm not sure if that is the case. Once political motivation is absent, the popular and widespread interest in the past as heritage will wane. So, turning now to the commemoration and the Decade of Centenaries, if we take the point that our interest in the public interpretation of the past in museums and as heritage is a concern with influencing contemporary society, and given the decade that is in it, it is worthwhile to consider the purpose of remembering national histories. My colleague Sarah McDowell at Ulster University describes commemoration as appearing to be about acknowledging the dead. Rather, commemoration is fused to the politics of the present and plays a crucial role in the negotiation of identity, power and place. She quotes Bodner's point that the past is commemorated concerns a struggle for supremacy within the political context. So she's mostly writing about the Troubles, commemorating the Troubles, looking at plaques, looking at monuments around Northern Ireland. So some of us in this room will remember 1998 and the national commemorations of 1798 and the resulting exhibitions in museums north and south. A century before our bicentenary events, the 100-year commemorations took a Catholic and more Gaelic focus and were used as a platform to launch the independence movement of the early 20th century. For the bicentenary, state commemoration took a more pluralistic approach, reflecting the careful negotiations of the peace process, leading to the Good Friday Agreement and the referendum in May 1998. In that year, the commemoration story provided a historical point of unity when Protestant dissenters, the lost leaders of 1798, joined with Catholics. So in the national press, the Ulster Museum was presented as a venue for the two communities, and this is a quote, desperate to reach out to one another, could come together. And a participant in one of these cross-community visits to the Ulster Museum said, this is something we could do together, something that would compromise no one's principles, theological or otherwise, something that could offer us a shared history. So now we'll go to 2016. Back in 1998, we were commemorating one period in history, and although there were many interpretations of it, the state machines north and south came up with a single narrative for that event. Now in the decade 2012 to 2022, because of the many anniversaries occurring in succession or coinciding, the commemorative experience is markedly different. Rather than remembering one period to which we might apply a shared story, we have multiple historical events. In 2016, it is tempting to claim a balance by delegating events to opposing communities. The Greens have the Easter Rising, and the Orange have the signing of the Covenant and the First World War. Such an approach would bring us back to the far too simplistic two traditions model of identity in the region. We are well aware of the tensions associated with concerning how we remember our past, and particularly the turbulent 20th century. Referring to 1996, the Cambridge historian David Reynolds describes the fallout of the 50th anniversary of the First World War as positively toxic. He, and he's not the only one, attributes rival commemorations of 1916 as rekindling sectarian animosity and sparking the Troubles. Now, we're in a very sensitive period in Northern Ireland, and we certainly don't want a repeat of that. Half a century later, in the contemporary narrative, the First World War has become a good news story for the peace process. The historian Richard Grayson has presented the First World War as a time when enemies united. This links very nicely with the contemporary narrative in Northern Ireland, within which rivals Martin McGuinness and the late Reverend Ian Paisley became known as the Chuckle Brothers. Regarding the memory of First World War, Grayson continues to describe how in the turmoil of the 1920s and the troubles of the late 20th century, this common history was lost. Nationalists and Republicans became ashamed of the service in the British Army, while Unionists simply did not know how many Catholics served. Starting out in 2007, the Diamond Memorial Project in Derry has found that there's a 50-50 distribution of Catholic and Protestant names from families on the War Memorial, and this was not well known in the city. The project was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and undertaken by a community-based organisation. Speaking in 2011 to the Committee for the Culture, Arts and Leisure as part of the review of the value and impact of museums in Northern Ireland, the head of the Heritage Lottery Fund, Paul Mullen, said that this project had transformed the War Memorial from a highly contested space that was frequently vandalised into a place where nationalists and unionists could commemorate together. So this all sounds fabulous. But as we renegotiate how we remember our history, there are still those who feel they're coming out as winners and others who feel that they're coming out as losers. For instance, as we come to terms with the losses and the recent troubles, we have to reframe our relationship with that past and emerging disillusionment with sacrifices people have made. So there's a real feeling of that growing. Returning to Richard Grayson again, he describes the shared history narrative emerging associated with the First World War has not been easy for many. Unionists, he said, have learned that they once shared much with nationalists, and Republicans have to confront the uneasy truth that their forebears once served in the British Army. This is neatly captured in a story told by the playwright and historian Philip Orr, which has done the rounds in Northern Ireland, and some of you may have heard the story already. He describes stopping in the street to talk to a man in East Belfast for whom the First World War was an important aspect of his identity and that of his community. The person reflected regretfully on the greening of the First World War. Orr repeats his words. They, as in the nationalists, have taken our country and now they want our war as well. And indeed, the Battle of the Somme, an event that once gave Northern Ireland's pro-British... Oh, and he quotes, this is Philip Orr in written work, he quotes that Northern Ireland's, the First World War, gave the pro-British working class a real sense of dignity and prowess. And now it has become this bittersweet sweet folk album of costly loyalty to the British Empire that has since lost interest in their actual welfare. So, while the First World War turns green, is there any chance of a shared narrative of the Easter Rising in Northern Ireland? For some, the Rising is valued as a Republican insurrection still unresolved. And for others, it was an opportunistic rebellion when Irish soldiers were serving in the Great War. The commemorative landscape in Northern Ireland puts the Rising firmly in the Republican tradition. Within this canon, it is the period that was idolised with its heroes sanctified. Recently, our newly appointed First Minister rejected any notion she would attend an Easter Rising commemorative events, adding that she would be prepared to go to a lecture or a symposium, but not a commemorative event. She rejected commemorative events because she regards the Rising, and these are her words, a very violent attack on the state that gave succour to violent republicanism. So we can see that this sort of commemoration is still painfully raw, ambiguous and divisive. And returning back to my colleagues Sarah McDowell and Mary Braniff, they ask in a recent book they've published, is commemoration in Northern Ireland a continuation of the war by another means? So I will just move to my first slide. So that is the context for 2016 in Northern Ireland. So what we've got now is a decade replete with ambiguity and painful memories. This is the state-led approach to planning for the period, informed by what they call the Creative Centenaries Initiative. So it was funded in Northern Ireland by the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure and the Community Relations Council and the Heritage Lottery Fund, and in the Republic by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So what this has become, this is one of the outcomes of it, but it's a project where they're bringing all these people together, they bring a lot of academics together, they bring a lot of community organisations together to discuss how should we do commemoration in this decade. And they've developed a framework for good commemoration, which is all about exploring diverse histories, looking beyond the island for other stories, and so on. So what this has become is this meticulously managed official gateway to commemoration in the region. So they've got principles for commemoration. So start from the historical facts, recognise implications and consequences, understand different perceptions, try and get a deeper understanding. They also have sort of another 10-point of stages to go through. So they're really, you can't say they haven't tried their best to plan for commemoration. So, by the way of the Heritage Lottery Fund now is highly involved in funding the National Museum, the Ulster Museum exhibition, funding community groups, funding local authority museums, and funding universities, as in our Living Legacies project. So these are the principles that are to underpin our work. So this is reflected in DCAL strategy, or OFM DFM strategies. So we've got the strategy from 2013, Together Building a United Community. And within that, they talk about museums as being a vital place for developing a better understanding of history, heritage and culture. Quoting from that report, they say that museums are valuable in building a culture of respect, tolerance and reconciliation. And they ask at the opening of the Decade of Centenaries that all our commemorative activities should have an educational focus of reflection, inclusivity, tolerance, respect, responsibility and interdependence. So in late 2014, National Museums Northern Ireland reopened their Modern History Gallery with a new interpretation of the past 500 years. And in the creation of that gallery, they adopted the official approach to the Decade of Centenaries, which is that of learning, reflection, inclusivity, tolerance, respect, and so on. And this is apparent in this very carefully curated space. And here they've had a focus on ephemera of history. So we see the chair that the Labour leader James Connolly stood on. We have a souvenir of the Ulster Covenant, reputedly signed in blood. We have blotting paper with the signature of the Ulster Unionist leader Edward Carson in reverse. We have a case of the First World War that features the names of nurses alongside their uniforms. We have German war items. We have a Russian helmet. We have a French haversack. We have the iconic object, which is the 36th Ulster Division flag with shrapnel damage displayed. And this acts as a backdrop to an original 1916 proclamation of the Irish Republic. There's a slide from it. So reflecting on the gallery, the DCAL Minister Carol de Coulihan describes the Ulster Museum as helping to lead innovative and inclusive approaches to remembering our shared past. So with many good programmes, and now praise from our DCAL Minister. So with that praise, can we now say our work is done? As museum practitioners well know, it is the role of museums to comment on the past, but with a history as dangerous as our own, is it the role of the museum to encourage a critical exploration of both what we remember and how we remember? The Creative Centenaries Initiative has made massive advances in supporting shared community commemoration, but we would be in denial if we didn't acknowledge the dissent at the margins, whose views on how we remember do not comply with the mantra of ethical and shared remembering. And this was well put in the Observer newspaper earlier in January, and this is a quote, this is directly from the newspaper. As with most major political issues or historical events, plans to commemorate Easter 2016 have produced splits in how Ireland remembers and interprets the revolt. Sinn Féin has decided to organise its own series of events independent of the government's official programme. The party is behind a major exhibition about the Easter Rising in a former cinema north of O'Connell Street. Dissident Republicans, meanwhile, have coalesced under the proliferating 1916 societies, which observers of republicanism believe is a political movement for all those opposed to peace and power sharing in Northern Ireland. So this is going back to Sarah McDowell's point about a continuation of the war by another means, by having this alternative commemoration programme. So it's that last point that is crucial to commemoration, as that being in opposition to peace and power sharing. So to finish, I've just got a few more slides to show. I know I didn't have a huge number. Actually, I'll just go back. I'm not sure. But just last week, I was in the Nerve Centre in Derry, having a cup of coffee in the cafe because my little one was at a birthday party, and I got the Derry Journal, the local newspaper, and was flicking through it. And I'm absolutely convinced that the Derry newspapers have more historical content than other regional newspapers across Northern Ireland. And I'm going to show you just two slides that were in the paper I read last Saturday that touch on the theme of this conference and my paper. So please look at the one on the left. So this is as a result of the Queen is shortly to be 90, and across the UK beacons are being lit, and it was discussed in the City Council whether Derry is going to have a beacon lit for the Queen's birthday. An independent councillor said, "Are we going to put the Queen on it?" So this was considered highly offensive. And then the second one from the same newspaper. So this was in regard to an invitation received by the council to attend a Somme centenary event organised by the British Army National Charity. And in the article, Councillor Warren Robinson describes the timing of the invitation, because it arrived around the time of the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which is the 30th of January, as a huge insult to the people of Derry. And the council voted not to attend, and the DUP councillor said the council had just turned its back on the Somme celebrations. So although on the one hand we do for sure have the shared agreed strategy for commemoration, on the other hand we do still have a very vocal number of people who have not bought into that programme, and that is the consequences, despite the absolutely great work done in the Ulster Museum and the great work done in our local museums. And many of you will know people who work in the local museum sector in Northern Ireland have done a huge amount of work bringing in different communities, ex-prisoner groups and so on into the galleries, and worked very closely with them. What these cuttings demonstrate is commemoration is still highly contested in Northern Ireland. So the work of our national museums and local museums have been effective in producing exhibitions that are meaningful to the majority, and I think that is important to note. But we cannot avoid the attitudes, which you might say, that are at the edges. So North and South minority views are prominent, and they will use commemoration activities to continue long established rivalries. It is this last point that we need to think further about, and it's exploration of that which is the duty of memory institutions working in such a context. Thank you very much.